The smell of antiseptic couldn't mask the metallic scent of blood that seemed permanently etched into his memory. Hospital corridors had become his battlefield now, not the deserts of Afghanistan where he once saved lives under enemy fire. For Marcus Chen, a decorated Navy SEAL medic, the transition from combat zones to civilian emergency rooms should have been seamless. After all, saving lives was saving lives, right? But when the ambulance doors burst open that rainy Tuesday evening, bringing in a young woman whose uniform bore the same emblem he once wore with pride, everything Marcus thought he had conquered came rushing back. His hands, which had performed countless life-saving procedures in the chaos of war, began to tremble. The steady voice that had guided wounded soldiers through their darkest moments fell silent. The woman on the stretcher wasn't just another patient. She was a mirror reflecting his own hidden wounds, ones that no Purple Heart could acknowledge and no medical degree could heal. In that moment, as alarms blared and his colleagues rushed past him, Marcus realized that some battles aren't fought with bullets and bandages. They're fought in the silent spaces between heartbeats, where courage and fear dance together in the shadows of the mind. This is the story of two warriors whose paths crossed not on foreign soil, but in a place where healing was supposed to happen. It's about the invisible scars that service members carry long after they've hung up their uniforms, and the unexpected moments that force them to confront the ghosts they thought they'd left behind. Sometimes the most important mission isn't the one you trained for, it's the one that finds you when you least expect it, demanding a different kind of bravery altogether. The emergency room at St. Mary's Hospital buzzed with its usual controlled chaos. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows that reminded Marcus Chen of the field hospitals where he'd spent 3 tours of duty. But this wasn't Kandahar or Helmand province. This was downtown Seattle, where the rain never seemed to stop and the coffee was always too strong. Marcus adjusted his white coat and checked his watch. 11 months, 2 weeks and 4 days since he'd traded his military fatigues for scrubs, not that he was counting. The transition program had prepared him for the technical aspects of civilian medicine, but no one had warned him about the quiet moments. In Afghanistan, there was always noise: helicopters, gunfire, radio chatter. Here, between patients, silence crept in like fog rolling off Puget Sound, bringing with it memories he'd rather forget. The automatic doors slid open with a mechanical whisper, and Marcus looked up to see Dr. Wright, Sarah Mitchell, entering the break room. She was the chief resident, sharp as a scalpel and twice as quick. In another life, she might have made a good officer. She'd been the one to recommend him for the position when the hospital director was skeptical about hiring former military personnel. "Chen, you're on trauma tonight," she said, not looking up from her tablet. "Rodriguez called in sick, and we're already short-staffed. Think you can handle it?" Marcus nodded, though something twisted in his stomach. Trauma cases were different here. In the field, you worked with what you had, makeshift supplies, limited time, and the constant threat of enemy fire. Here, he had every tool imaginable, but somehow that made it harder. The pressure of perfection, of having no excuse for failure, weighed heavier than his old combat pack ever had. The first few hours passed uneventfully. A broken arm from a skateboarding accident. An elderly man with chest pains that turned out to be heartburn. A college student who'd had too much to drink. Routine cases that allowed his mind to wander, which was dangerous territory. Marcus had learned to keep busy, to fill every moment with action or purpose. Idle thoughts had a way of drifting toward places he didn't want to go. It was just past midnight when the call came in. Motor vehicle accident, multiple casualties, ETA 5 minutes. Marcus felt the familiar surge of adrenaline, the sharpening of focus that had kept him alive overseas. This was what he was good at. This was where he belonged. The first ambulance arrived with a family of 4. Minor injuries, mostly cuts and bruises. The parents were shaken but coherent, their 2 children scared but unharmed. Marcus worked efficiently, cleaning wounds and ordering x-rays, his hands steady and sure. The second ambulance brought an elderly couple, the husband unconscious but stable, the wife with a broken wrist and shock setting in. Standard trauma protocol, nothing he hadn't handled 100 times before. It was the third ambulance that changed everything. The paramedic who jumped out was someone Marcus recognized from previous cases, Tom Bradley, a 20-year veteran who'd seen it all and rarely looked rattled. Tonight, his face was grim, his movements urgent in a way that spoke of serious business inside the vehicle. "Single vehicle collision," Tom called out as they wheeled the gurney through the automatic doors. Female, approximately 25, found unconscious at the scene. Possible head trauma. Definitely some internal bleeding. She was wearing this when we found her. Tom held up a military ID card, the same type Marcus had carried for 8 years. But it wasn't the ID that made his breath catch in his throat, it was the uniform. Even torn and bloodied, he could make out the insignia, the patches, the particular shade of desert camouflage that had once been as familiar as his own skin. The woman on the gurney was young, probably fresh out of basic training. Her face was pale beneath the oxygen mask, a stark contrast to the dark hair that had come loose from its regulation bun. There was something about her that reminded Marcus of his younger sister, the same determined set to her jaw even in unconsciousness. "What's her name?" Marcus asked, though he wasn't sure why it mattered. "Sergeant Lisa Martinez," Tom replied, checking his paperwork. "According to her tags, she's stationed at Joint Base Lewis McChord. Looks like she was heading home on leave when this happened." Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. Lewis McChord was where he'd processed out of the military, where he'd sat in countless debriefing sessions, filling out forms and attending seminars about civilian reintegration, where a psychiatrist with kind eyes and a clipboard had asked him repeatedly if he was experiencing any nightmares, any flashbacks, any difficulty adjusting to life outside the service. "Chen?" Dr. Mitchell's voice cut through his thoughts. "We need to move. She's losing blood fast." Marcus snapped back to the present, his training taking over. But as they wheeled Sergeant Martinez toward Trauma Bay 2, he caught sight of her left shoulder patch. It was partially obscured by blood, but he could make out enough to recognize it. The same unit patch he'd worn during his second deployment. The same eagle and anchor that had been sewn onto his own uniform when he'd pulled wounded soldiers from burning vehicles and performed surgery under mortar fire. His hands began to shake. It started as a barely perceptible tremor, the kind that might go unnoticed in the rush of emergency treatment. But Marcus felt it like an earthquake, each small movement of his fingers amplified by the weight of memory. He'd seen this before, in other soldiers, other medics who'd reached their breaking point. He'd never imagined it would happen to him. "BP's dropping," one of the nurses called out. "We need to get her into surgery now." Marcus tried to focus on the medical needs in front of him. Lisa Martinez was young and strong, the kind of soldier who'd probably been at the top of her physical fitness scores. Her body was fighting, but the internal bleeding was winning. Standard protocol called for immediate surgical intervention, blood transfusion, possible exploratory surgery to locate the source of the hemorrhaging. But every time he looked at her uniform, every time he saw that patch, his mind transported him back to a different hospital in a different country. He could smell the desert dust mixed with the metallic scent of blood. He could hear the helicopter rotors beating overhead and the distant sound of gunfire. He could see the faces of soldiers he'd tried to save, some successfully, some not. "Marcus!" Dr. Mitchell's sharp voice cut through the flashback. "What's wrong with you? We need to intubate now." He looked down at his hands, still trembling, and realized he'd been standing frozen for nearly 30 seconds. The other medical staff were staring at him, with expressions ranging from confusion to concern. This wasn't like him. Marcus Chen was known for his steady hands and calm demeanor under pressure. He was the one other residents came to when they needed someone reliable in a crisis. "I'm fine," he managed to say, though his voice sounded strange to his own ears. "Just give me a second." But he wasn't fine, and they all knew it. "Doctor." Mitchell stepped closer, her eyes searching his face for answers. "Maybe you should step out," she said quietly. "Let someone else take lead on this one." The suggestion felt like a physical blow. Marcus had never walked away from a patient, never abandoned his post when someone needed him. It went against everything he'd been taught, both in the military and in medical school. You don't leave a soldier behind. You don't give up when lives are at stake. Yet here he stood, frozen by the sight of a uniform patch, paralyzed by memories he thought he buried deep enough to stay hidden. Sergeant Lisa Martinez needed him to be the medic who'd saved dozens of lives under enemy fire. Instead, she was getting the broken version, the one who couldn't keep his hand steady when confronted with his own past. As the trauma team worked around him preparing Lisa for emergency surgery, Marcus caught another glimpse of her face. Even unconscious, there was something defiant about her expression, something that spoke of the same stubborn determination that had carried him through his darkest moments overseas. She was a fighter, just like he'd been, just like he was supposed to still be. The realization hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't just about his own demons anymore. Somewhere, Sergeant Lisa Martinez had family waiting for her to come home from leave. Parents who expected a phone call, friends who were probably already worried about why she hadn't checked in. She was someone's daughter, maybe someone's sister or girlfriend. She had a life worth saving, and he was failing her, because he couldn't get past his own psychological wounds. Dr. Mitchell made the decision for him. Johnson, take over, she called to another resident. Chen, my office, now. Marcus watched helplessly as his colleague stepped in, taking his place beside the gurney. Lisa Martinez disappeared through the doors to the surgical wing, her fate now in other hands. The weight of that failure, of stepping away when he was needed most, settled over him like a lead blanket. As he followed Dr. Mitchell toward her office, Marcus couldn't shake the image of that unit patch. Bloodied, but still recognizable. It was a symbol of service, of dedication to something greater than oneself. Tonight, he'd betrayed everything it stood for. Tonight, he'd learned that some wounds go deeper than flesh and bone, and some battles don't end just because you've left the battlefield. The door to Dr. Mitchell's office closed with a soft click. But to Marcus, it sounded like the end of everything he'd tried to build since coming home. Outside in the trauma bay, machines beeped and voices called out medical instructions. Life went on, patients were treated, and somewhere in an operating room, Sergeant Lisa Martinez fought for her life, while the medic who should have been helping her sat in an office, trying to explain why the sight of a uniform patch had reduced him to a trembling shadow of his former self. The real battle, Marcus realized, wasn't over. It had just begun. Doctor, Sarah Mitchell's office was smaller than Marcus expected, cramped with medical journals and case files stacked on every available surface. A single window looked out onto the parking lot, where ambulances came and went like mechanical heartbeats in the night. She gestured for him to sit in the worn leather chair across from her desk, but Marcus remained standing, his hands clasped behind his back, in a pose that felt more military than medical. "Talk to me, Chen," she said, settling into her chair with the practiced ease of someone who'd had many difficult conversations in this room. "What just happened out there?" Marcus stared at the diplomas on her wall, anything to avoid meeting her eyes. How could he explain that the sight of a uniform patch had unraveled 8 years of military discipline in 30 seconds? How could he make her understand that the trembling in his hands wasn't just nervousness, but the physical manifestation of memories he'd spent months trying to suppress? "I had a momentary lapse in focus," he said finally, the words feeling inadequate even as he spoke them. "It won't happen again." Bullshit. The word cut through the air with surgical precision. Dr. Mitchell leaned forward, her expression shifting from professional concern to something more personal. "I've watched you work for almost a year, Marcus. You don't have lapses in focus. You're the most composed resident I've ever supervised. So whatever just happened, it wasn't a simple distraction." Marcus finally met her gaze, seeing something unexpected there. Not judgment or disappointment, but recognition. It was the look of someone who understood that the human mind could be just as fragile as the bodies they worked to heal. "The patient," he said quietly. "She was wearing my old unit patch." The words hung between them like a confession. "Doctor." Mitchell nodded slowly, and Marcus realized she'd probably seen this before. St. Mary's had a reputation for hiring veterans, partly because of their experience with trauma medicine, partly because of their discipline and work ethic. But that meant she'd also seen what happened when the past refused to stay buried. "PTSD?" she asked, using the clinical term with the same matter-of-fact tone she might use to discuss a broken bone. "No." The denial came quickly, automatically. "I was evaluated before discharge. Clean bill of mental health. No signs of post-traumatic stress, no adjustment disorders, nothing that would interfere with civilian life." "Then explain to me why you froze when you saw that patch." Marcus turned away from her, walking to the window where he could watch the controlled chaos of the emergency entrance. An ambulance was pulling away, its mission complete, while another sat waiting with its crew playing cards in the driver's cab. Normal night in the life of an urban hospital. Nothing that should remind him of anything except the job he'd chosen to do. "You want to know about Afghanistan?" he said without turning around. "I'll tell you about Afghanistan. 3 tours, 36 months total time in country, 47 successful medical evacuations under fire. I saved more lives than I lost, maintained unit readiness at 96%, and came home with commendations and a clean psychological evaluation."
"That's your record, Dr. Zalger,"
Mitchell said. "I'm asking about your experience." The question hit deeper than any physical wound. Marcus had spent so many months focusing on the statistics, the measurable aspects of his service, that he'd almost convinced himself they told the whole story. Numbers didn't lie after all. They couldn't be interpreted or twisted by emotions or fear. They were clean, objective, safe. But experience was messier. "There was a convoy," he said, the words coming slowly, like water from a damaged pipe. "About 6 months before my final deployment ended, IED took out the lead vehicle. Small arms fire from both sides of the road. Standard ambush, nothing we hadn't dealt with before. He could see it playing out in the reflection of the window glass, superimposed over the Seattle parking lot like a ghost movie. Desert sand mixed with hospital asphalt, the sound of helicopters merging with ambulance sirens. I was in the second truck with 2 other soldiers. Private Jackson, 22 years old from Texas, had a picture of his girlfriend taped to his helmet. Corporal Williams, career military, 15 years of service, 3 kids back home. The blast flipped our vehicle and Williams was pinned underneath. Marcus paused, his breath fogging the window glass. He'd never told this story, not to the military psychologists, not to anyone. It had stayed locked away in the same mental compartment where he kept all his Afghanistan memories, carefully sealed and labeled, handled. Williams was conscious but trapped, internal bleeding, probably liver damage, maybe spleen. Jackson was hurt but mobile. Standard protocol was to establish a perimeter, wait for backup, evacuate casualties in order of medical priority. But that's not what happened, Dr. Mitchell said quietly. Williams looked at me, and he said, "Don't let me die here, Doc. My kids are counting on me to come home." And I knew, medically speaking, that he probably had 20, maybe 30 minutes before blood loss became critical. Backup was 15 minutes out. By the book, we should have waited. Marcus turned from the window, finally facing the truth he'd been avoiding for 11 months. But Jackson was scared. Kid had never been in a real firefight before, and he was starting to panic. The kind of panic that gets people killed. So I made a choice. I told him to help me move Williams, to get him clear of the vehicle so we could set up a proper medical station. You prioritized morale over medical protocol. I prioritized keeping my team together over following the book. And it worked. We got Williams stabilized, Jackson kept it together, and backup arrived right on schedule. Williams made it home to his kids. Jackson finished his tour and went back to college. Everyone lived, everyone went home. Mission accomplished. Doctor. Mitchell studied his face with the intensity of someone reading an X-ray. So what's the problem? Sounds like you made the right call. The problem is that it wasn't medicine. It was improvisation based on intuition and luck. In a field hospital, with proper equipment and trained staff, Williams would have been stable in 5 minutes. Out there, in that convoy, I was just guessing, making it up as I went along, and everyone acted like I was some kind of hero for it. The admission felt like pulling shrapnel from a wound. Marcus had carried the weight of that success like a burden, because it represented everything he'd learned to distrust about his own judgment. In the controlled environment of a hospital, there were protocols, procedures, best practices backed by research and experience. In the field, there was only instinct and hope. You think you're a fraud, Dr. Mitchell said. I think I'm a medic who got lucky a lot of times, and now I'm in a place where luck isn't enough, where precision matters more than improvisation, and where making the wrong choice doesn't just risk one life, it risks everything I've tried to build since coming home. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant sounds of the hospital continuing its work. Somewhere in the surgical wing, Sergeant Lisa Martinez was fighting for her life, while Marcus sat in an office, unpacking the psychological baggage that had prevented him from helping her. The irony wasn't lost on him. There's something else. Doctor, Mitchell said, something you're not telling me. Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. You're very good at this. Did you study psychology before medicine? I studied people. Now talk. The night before that convoy, Williams asked me about my plans after discharge. Said he was thinking about getting out too, maybe becoming a paramedic or something. Uses military medical training in civilian life. He had this whole vision of helping people without worrying about getting shot at. Marcus sat down heavily in the leather chair, suddenly feeling the weight of 11 months' worth of suppressed anxiety. He made it sound so simple, like the hard part was over, and all we had to do was transfer our skills to a safer environment. Like being a soldier medic was just preparation for being a civilian medic, but it's not that simple. No, it's not. Because out there, in Afghanistan, I knew exactly who I was. I was Doc Chen, the guy who could stabilize a sucking chest wound with a field dressing and medical tape. I was the medic who'd crawl into enemy fire to reach wounded soldiers. I had a purpose, a mission, a clear understanding of what success looked like. Marcus gestured towards the window, where the emergency room continued its work without him. Here, I'm just another resident, trying not to make mistakes. I have access to every piece of medical technology imaginable, but I second-guess every decision. I have protocols for everything, but I can't shake the feeling that I'm pretending to be something I'm not. And when you saw that patch tonight, it reminded you of who you used to be. It reminded me of who I might still be. Sergeant Martinez was lying there, bleeding, needing help, and for just a moment, I saw myself the way I was in Afghanistan. Confident, decisive, unafraid. And then reality hit, and I realized that version of myself might not exist anymore. Doctor, Mitchell leaned back in her chair, processing everything he'd told her. Outside, another ambulance pulled up to the emergency entrance, its lights painting red and blue patterns on the office walls. Life and death continued their eternal dance, with or without Marcus Chen's participation. "You know what I think?" she said finally. "I think you're putting too much pressure on yourself to be perfect in a civilian context, when what made you effective in a military context was your willingness to be imperfect but decisive. That's a nice theory, but it doesn't help Sergeant Martinez." "Actually, it might. Because while you were in here having a psychological breakdown, she was in surgery having her life saved by a surgical team that included 2 other former military medics who understood exactly what they were dealing with. Dr. Rue Johnson, who took over when you stepped away, served 2 tours in Iraq. The anesthesiologist is a former army nurse. The surgeon is civilian, but her brother was a Marine." Marcus felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of tension he hadn't realized he was carrying. "Is she going to be okay?" "Touch and go for the next few hours, but the prognosis is good. Internal bleeding was from a torn spleen, which they've repaired. No brain injury, no permanent damage. She'll probably be asking for a uniform back by tomorrow afternoon." The relief was overwhelming, but it came with a new weight of understanding. He'd let his own psychological wounds prevent him from helping a patient, but the system had compensated. Other hands had taken over, other skills had been applied, and the mission had been accomplished without him. "I need to see her," he said. "No, you need to go home and get some sleep. And tomorrow, you need to make an appointment with Dr. Reynolds in psychiatry. Not because there's something wrong with you, but because there's something right with you that you're not accessing." Dr. Mitchell stood up, signaling the end of their conversation. But as Marcus reached the door, she called his name. "For what it's worth," she said, "I think your instincts about prioritizing team cohesion over strict protocol were probably right. And I think Williams was right too. The skills you learned in Afghanistan do transfer to civilian medicine. You just need to trust yourself enough to use them." As Marcus walked through the hospital corridors toward the exit, he passed the recovery ward where Sergeant Lisa Martinez would soon be waking up to discover that she'd survived her brush with death. Tomorrow she'd begin the long process of healing, of putting her life back together after sudden trauma. It occurred to him that maybe they had more in common than just a uniform patch. Maybe they were both soldiers learning how to fight battles they'd never trained for, in places that were supposed to be safe. And maybe healing, whether physical or psychological, required the same kind of stubborn determination that had carried them through their military service. The automatic doors slid shut behind him as Marcus stepped into the Seattle night, where rain fell steadily and the city continued its restless sleep. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new patients, new opportunities to prove that Doc Chen still existed somewhere inside the civilian version of himself. Tonight, though, he just needed to remember how to breathe. Marcus arrived at the hospital the next morning carrying 2 cups of coffee and a weight of uncertainty that had kept him awake most of the night. The appointment with Dr. Rector Reynolds wasn't until afternoon, which left him with 8 hours to pretend everything was normal, while the memory of his breakdown played on repeat in his mind. The emergency department was unusually quiet for a Thursday morning, with only a handful of patients waiting in triage, and the overnight chaos settled into the routine hum of shift change. Marcus checked the assignment board and found his name listed for general rotation. No trauma cases, no high-pressure situations. Doctor Mitchell's doing, no doubt, protective custody for the wounded medic. Chen! Dr. Johnson's voice carried across the nurse's station with its usual energy. Heard you had an interesting night. Everything okay? Marcus forced a smile and nodded, though he wondered how much of the story had already spread through hospital gossip. Medical facilities were small communities, and news traveled fast when one of their own had a moment of weakness. Just tired, he said. Long shift. Well, if it makes you feel any better, the soldier from last night is doing great. Martinez, right? She's awake, alert, and already driving the recovery nurses crazy with questions about when she can go back to duty. Something tightened in Marcus's chest. He'd been avoiding the recovery ward all morning, telling himself it was to give Sergeant Martinez space to heal without the reminder of his failure. But the truth was simpler and more cowardly. He didn't want to face her, didn't want to see the person whose life he'd walked away from in her moment of need. Has she asked about the medical team? Marcus found himself asking. Actually, she has. Wants to thank everyone who worked on her. I told her it was a team effort, but she's pretty insistent about meeting each person individually. Military thing, probably. Honor and gratitude and all that. Johnson moved on to other topics, but Marcus found himself thinking about Sergeant Martinez's request. In his experience, Most patients were content to know they'd been saved without needing details about who did what. But soldiers were different. They understood the weight of debt, the importance of acknowledging the people who'd stood between them and death. The morning passed slowly with routine cases that should have been enough to occupy his mind but weren't. A businessman with chest pains that turned out to be anxiety. A construction worker with a lacerated hand that needed 12 stitches. A college student with appendicitis. Each patient received his full attention, his best medical care, but part of him remained distracted by thoughts of the woman recovering 3 floors above. At 11:30, Marcus found himself in the elevator, pressing the button for the recovery ward before he could talk himself out of it. The ride up felt longer than usual, giving him time to rehearse what he might say. How do you explain to a patient that you froze when they needed you most? How do you apologize for failing at the one thing you trained your entire adult life to do? The recovery ward was quieter than the emergency department, with soft lighting and the steady beep of monitoring equipment creating a peaceful atmosphere designed to promote healing. Marcus approached the nurse's station, where a woman in her 50s looked up from her charts with a questioning expression. "I'm Dr. Chen from Emergency," he said. "I wanted to check on Sergeant Martinez." "Room 314, the nurse replied with a smile. "She's been asking about the medical team. You're the third person who's come up to visit her this morning." Marcus made his way down the hallway, passing rooms filled with patients in various stages of recovery. The familiar sounds of a hospital, quiet conversations, television broadcasts, the squeak of wheels on linoleum, created a backdrop that should have been comforting. Instead, each step toward room 314 felt like walking toward a judgment he wasn't ready to face. He paused outside her door, gathering courage that had once come naturally in much more dangerous situations. Through the partially open door, he could see Sergeant Lisa Martinez sitting up in bed, her dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun despite her civilian hospital gown. She was young, maybe 24 or 25, with the kind of alert posture that spoke of military discipline even in a hospital bed. Marcus knocked softly and waited for her response before entering. When he stepped into the room, Lisa Martinez looked up from the magazine she'd been reading, and her expression shifted to one of curious attention. "Sergeant Martinez?" he said, maintaining the formal tone that felt appropriate when addressing another service member. "I'm Dr. Chen from the emergency department. I wanted to check on your recovery." "Dr. Chen." Her voice was stronger than he'd expected, with only a slight hoarseness that suggested recent intubation. "I was hoping I'd get to meet you. Please, come in." As he moved closer to her bed, Marcus noticed details that hadn't been visible during the trauma last night. Lisa Martinez had intelligent brown eyes that seemed to take in everything about him with a single glance. Her skin had regained most of its color, and despite being connected to various monitoring devices, she projected an air of competence and determination. "How are you feeling?" he asked, falling back on professional routine to mask his nervousness. "Like I got hit by a truck but alive," she replied with a slight smile. "Which I'm told is largely thanks to you and your team. Dr. Johnson said you were the first to assess my injuries when I came in." Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest. "Actually, Dr. Johnson took lead on your case. I was only involved in the initial evaluation." Something shifted in her expression, a subtle change that suggested she'd caught the deflection in his answer. Military training included reading people, understanding when someone wasn't telling the complete truth. Lisa Martinez might be young, but she was clearly observant. "Dr. Johnson mentioned that this hospital has several former military personnel on staff," she said, steering the conversation in a different direction. "He said you served as well. 3 tours in Afghanistan. Combat medic." The words came automatically, part of an identity he'd carried for so long that it felt strange to discuss in past tense. "What unit?" "Various assignments. Task Force Med, mostly embedded with infantry companies during patrol operations." Lisa nodded with the understanding of someone who'd lived in that world. "I just finished my first deployment," she said. "Medical Corps as well, though mostly base operations. Nothing like what you probably dealt with." There was something in her tone that suggested she understood the weight of combat medical service, the unique pressure of making life and death decisions under enemy fire. Marcus found himself studying her face, seeing echoes of soldiers he'd served with, the combination of youth and premature maturity that came with military experience. "Were you heading home on leave when the accident happened?" he asked. "Just started a 2-week break. Had plans to visit family in Oregon, maybe do some hiking in the Cascades. Nothing too exciting, but after 6 months of desert sand and military routine, the idea of rain and mountains seemed pretty appealing." As she talked, Marcus noticed that Lisa Martinez had a way of making conversation that put people at ease. It was a skill he recognized from his own experience, the ability to connect with people quickly, to build trust in high-pressure situations. Medical personnel developed it naturally, but military service refined it into something more precise. "Your family must be worried," he said. "Have you been able to contact them?" "Called my mum this morning. She wanted to fly down immediately, but I convinced her I'd be fine. Military families learn to handle these kinds of situations. We're used to unexpected phone calls and sudden changes in plans." There was a pause in the conversation, and Marcus realized he was enjoying talking with her. Lisa Martinez had the kind of direct, honest communication style that reminded him of the best soldiers he'd served with. No drama, no manipulation, just straightforward interaction between two people who understood each other's background. "Can I ask you something?" she said, her tone becoming slightly more serious. "Of course. When I was brought in last night, was there something unusual about my case? Something that made it more complicated than a standard trauma?" The question caught him off guard. Marcus found himself studying her face again, looking for clues about what she might have observed or overheard. Patients were often more aware of their treatment than medical staff realized, picking up on conversations and nuances that revealed information about their condition. "What makes you ask that, Dr. Reeks?" "Johnson mentioned that there was a change in personnel during my initial treatment. Someone stepped away, and he took over. It's not a big deal. I know these things happen. But I got the impression there was more to the story." Marcus felt his carefully constructed composure beginning to crack. Of course she'd noticed. Military personnel were trained to pay attention to details, to understand command structures and personnel changes. Lisa Martinez wasn't just a patient. She was a soldier who understood how teams functioned and what it meant when someone was replaced unexpectedly. "Medical emergencies are dynamic situations," he said, trying to maintain professional distance. "Personnel changes happen for various reasons." Dr. Kwaya Chen. Her voice carried the kind of authority that came with military leadership training. "I'm not asking as a patient trying to find fault with my medical care. I'm asking as one service member to another. Was there something about my case that created a problem for the person who stepped away?" The directness of her question, the understanding it revealed about the complexity of his situation, broke through his defenses in a way that Dr. Mitchell's professional concern hadn't been able to. Lisa Martinez wasn't asking for an apology or an explanation. She was asking for the truth. Soldier to soldier. "You were wearing a unit patch," he said quietly. "The same one I wore during my second deployment." Understanding dawned in her eyes, followed immediately by something that looked like recognition.
"And seeing it brought back memories you weren't prepared to handle. Something like that."
Lisa was quiet for a long moment, processing this information with the same careful consideration she'd probably applied to military briefings and mission planning.
When she spoke again, her voice carried a different quality. Not the formal tone of a patient speaking to a doctor, but the understanding voice of one soldier speaking to another. "How long have you been out?" 11 months and 3 weeks. "And how long since you've talked to anyone about what happened over there?" The question hit him like a physical blow. Not because it was unexpected, but because it revealed how clearly she understood his situation. Marcus realized that Lisa Martinez wasn't just a patient who happened to be military. She was someone who'd been trained to recognize the signs of psychological stress in fellow service members. "I was evaluated before discharge," he said, falling back on the same defense he'd used with Dr. Barrayo. "Mitchell. Clean bill of mental health. That's not what I asked." The simple statement carried the weight of absolute truth. Military psychological evaluations were designed to identify severe cases that might pose immediate risks. They weren't designed to address the complex process of psychological adaptation that happened when warriors tried to become civilians. "I haven't," he admitted. "Talked about it, to anyone." "Then maybe last night wasn't really about my uniform patch. Maybe it was about finally having an excuse to acknowledge that the transition isn't as simple as everyone pretends it is." Her words settled over him like a diagnosis. Accurate, uncomfortable, but somehow relieving in its honesty. Marcus found himself looking at Lisa Martinez with a new kind of respect, seeing not just a patient or even a fellow veteran, but someone who understood the invisible battles that continued long after the obvious wars had ended.
"I froze," he said, the admission feeling like pulling shrapnel from a wound.
"When you needed me most, I couldn't function. But someone else could. The system worked, the mission was accomplished, and I'm sitting here having this conversation. That's what matters. Is it? In the military, we learn that individual failure doesn't necessarily equal mission failure. Sometimes the best thing a soldier can do is recognize when they need to step aside and let someone else take over. It takes courage to make that choice. Marcus looked out the window of her room, where Seattle continued its daily routine under cloudy skies. Somewhere in this city, other veterans were struggling with their own transitions, fighting battles that had no clear objectives or measurable victories. Some would succeed, some would fail, and most would find themselves somewhere in between, functional but wounded, capable but changed. "I have an appointment with a psychiatrist this afternoon," he said. "Good. And after that?" "I don't know." Lisa Martinez smiled, and for the first time since he'd entered her room, Marcus saw something that reminded him of the soldiers he'd served with. The ability to find hope in uncertain situations, to move forward even when the path wasn't clear. "One mission at a time," she said. "That's how we learn to handle everything else." As Marcus prepared to leave her room, he realized that this conversation had accomplished something that months of civilian therapy might not have achieved. Lisa Martinez had given him permission to be imperfect, to struggle, to acknowledge that healing was a process rather than a destination. She'd reminded him that the skills he'd learned in Afghanistan, adaptability, resilience, the ability to function as part of a team, were still relevant, even in situations he'd never trained for. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For helping me remember who I used to be." "Dr. Chen," she said as he reached the door. "You didn't lose who you used to be. You're just figuring out how to be that person in a different context." As Marcus walked back toward the elevator, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months, a sense of mission clarity. The battle wasn't over, but at least now he understood what he was fighting for. Not just his own recovery, but his ability to serve again, to be the medic who could stand steady when others needed him most. The elevator doors closed, carrying him back to the emergency department, where other patients waited and other challenges loomed. But for the first time since leaving Afghanistan, Marcus Chen felt like he might be ready to face them. Dr. Faventus. Patricia Reynolds had the kind of office that felt more like a living room than a medical facility. Soft lighting replaced harsh fluorescence, comfortable chairs faced each other across a low table, and the walls displayed artwork instead of medical certificates. Marcus had expected something more clinical, more reminiscent of the military psychiatrist he'd encountered during discharge processing. "Thank you for coming on such short notice, Doctor," Reynolds said as she settled into her chair with a steaming cup of tea. She was younger than Marcus had expected, probably in her early 40s, with prematurely grey hair and eyes that seemed to see more than they revealed. "Dr. Mitchell mentioned you'd had a difficult experience yesterday." Marcus sat rigidly in the offered chair, his posture automatically military despite the casual environment. "I froze during a trauma case." "Aye." Patient was a fellow veteran, and something about seeing her uniform triggered a response I wasn't prepared for. "Tell me about that response." "Shaking hands, inability to focus, flashback symptoms. Textbook anxiety reaction. Probably stress-related." Marcus delivered the information like a medical report, keeping his tone professional and detached. If he could frame it in clinical terms, maybe it would feel less personal. Dr. Reynolds made a note but didn't immediately respond to his self-diagnosis. "How long have you been experiencing these symptoms?" "Yesterday was the first time they interfered with my work." "That's not what I asked." The gentle correction reminded him of Lisa Martinez's directness the day before. Marcus realized he'd fallen into the habit of answering the questions he wanted to address rather than the ones being asked. "I've had some sleep disturbances since discharge, occasional nightmares, hypervigilance in crowded spaces, startle responses to sudden noises. But nothing that impacted my ability to function. Until yesterday. Until yesterday." "Doctor." Reynolds set down her tea and leaned forward slightly, her posture conveying attention without pressure. "Marcus. May I call you Marcus? What I'm hearing is that you've been managing symptoms for almost a year without seeking support. Is that accurate?" The military evaluation indicated no need for ongoing psychiatric care. The military evaluation is designed to identify immediate risks to self or others. It's not designed to address the normal process of psychological transition that most veterans experience when returning to civilian life. Marcus felt something defensive rise in his chest. "I completed all required debriefing sessions. I participated in transition assistance programs. I followed recommended protocols for reintegration." "And how did those programs address the emotional and psychological aspects of your service experience?" "They focused on practical skills. Resume writing, job interview techniques, benefits administration." The assumption was that if you handled the practical aspects correctly, the psychological aspects would resolve themselves. But that's not how the human mind works, is it? The question hung in the air between them, highlighting the gap between military efficiency and psychological reality. Marcus had approached his transition like a mission brief. Identify objectives, allocate resources, execute plan, achieve success. But emotions weren't soldiers that could be ordered into formation. Dr. Reynolds. I've saved lives under enemy fire. I've performed complex medical procedures in conditions that would challenge most civilian physicians. I shouldn't need therapy because I got rattled by seeing a uniform patch. You're right. You shouldn't need therapy for that reason. But you might need therapy because you've experienced things that most people never will. And you've carried the weight of life and death decisions for years without processing how that experience has affected you. Marcus stood up and walked to the window where he could see the hospital parking lot 3 stories below. The same view he'd had from Dr. Mitchell's office the night before, but somehow it looked different in afternoon sunlight. Less like a battlefield, more like a place where ordinary people came and went with ordinary concerns. What am I supposed to process? He asked. I did my job. I served with honor. I came home in one piece. Millions of veterans have done the same thing without needing psychological support. And millions of veterans struggle with the transition without seeking help. The fact that others don't get support doesn't mean you don't need it. Doctor. Reynolds joined him at the window, standing close enough to offer presence without invading his personal space. It was a technique Marcus recognized. The same kind of careful positioning he'd used with frightened soldiers, who needed medical attention but were too shaken to accept help easily. Tell me about Afghanistan, she said quietly. What about it? Whatever you want to share. A typical day, a specific mission, the way you felt about your role there, anything that feels relevant. Marcus found himself thinking about Lisa Martinez's question the day before, how long since he'd talked to anyone about what happened over there. Not the official version, sanitized for family consumption and military records, but the real experience of being Doc Chen in a war zone where medicine and violence intersected every day. The thing about being a combat medic, he said slowly, is that you exist in this strange space between healing and killing. You're there to save lives, but you're also part of a military unit whose primary mission might involve taking lives. Most of the time, those two roles don't conflict, but sometimes they do. Give me an example. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, accessing memories he'd kept carefully compartmentalized. There was a mission about 18 months into my second tour. We were providing medical support for a unit conducting house-to-house searches in a village outside Kandahar. Intelligence suggested insurgent activity, possible weapons cache, the usual scenario. He could see it playing out in his mind with the clarity that traumatic memories sometimes retained. Colors too vivid, sounds too sharp, emotions too intense for comfortable recollection. We entered a compound where a family was hiding in the back room. Grandmother, mother, 3 children. The youngest was maybe 5 years old, sick with what looked like pneumonia. High fever, difficulty breathing, clearly in need of immediate medical attention. What did you do? Standard protocol was to complete the search first, secure the area, then attend to medical needs if time permitted. But this kid was dying. You could see it in his breathing pattern, the color of his lips, maybe an hour before respiratory failure, probably less. Marcus turned away from the window, meeting Dr. Reynolds' eyes for the first time since beginning the story. So I made a choice. I told the unit leader I needed to stabilize the child before we continued the search. Broke out my medical kit, started treatment for pneumonia, got an IV going for hydration. That sounds like good medical decision-making. It was. The kid responded to treatment, his breathing improved, fever came down. Within 30 minutes, he was stable enough for transport to a civilian medical facility. I probably saved his life. But while I was focused on treating the child, my unit found the weapons cache they were looking for. Hidden in the wall of the same room where the family was staying. Enough explosives to make IEDs that could have killed dozens of coalition soldiers. Marcus sat back down, the weight of the memory settling over him like a familiar burden. The intelligence was correct. This wasn't just a sick kid. It was a family actively supporting insurgent operations. The weapons were hidden in the children's bedroom, for God's sake. How did that make you feel? Conflicted. I'd saved the life of a child whose family was trying to kill my fellow soldiers. I'd prioritized my oath as a medic over my duty as a military member. And the worst part was, I'd do it again. Even knowing what I know now, I'd still treat that sick kid, Doctor. Reynolds nodded slowly, and Marcus could see her processing the complexity of the situation he'd described. You were facing an impossible choice between competing ethical obligations.
Exactly.
And that's the thing about combat medicine. You make these choices every day. Who gets treated first when you have multiple casualties and limited resources? How much risk do you accept to reach a wounded soldier? When do medical priorities override tactical considerations? Every decision carries moral weight, and there's never enough information to be certain you're making the right choice. And when you came home? When I came home, I was supposed to leave all that behind. No more impossible choices, no more conflict between healing and military objectives. Just pure medicine in a controlled environment where the biggest ethical dilemma might be resource allocation during busy periods. Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. Except it turns out that the ability to make quick decisions under pressure, the willingness to act when others hesitate, the comfort with moral ambiguity, those aren't skills you can just turn off when you change uniforms. So when you saw Sergeant Martinez last night, wearing the uniform that represented all those impossible choices, I realized I'd been pretending that part of my life was over, that I could just be a normal doctor treating normal patients with normal medical problems. But the truth is, that's not who I am. I'm Doc Chen, the guy who makes life and death decisions in impossible circumstances, and I didn't know if that person still existed in a civilian context. Dr. Reynolds returned to her chair, making notes while maintaining eye contact with Marcus. What do you think now? After talking with Sergeant Martinez, after recognizing what happened, I think maybe the question isn't whether Doc Chen still exists, but whether I can find a way to be him in this new environment. Whether the skills I learned in Afghanistan can translate to civilian medicine without the psychological burden of war. That's exactly right. And that's what we're going to work on together. For the first time since entering her office, Marcus felt something loosen in his chest. Not relief exactly, but recognition that the battle he'd been fighting alone might be winnable with proper support. How long does this take? He asked. That depends on you. Some veterans need months, others need years. A few need ongoing support indefinitely. But all of them need to understand that seeking help isn't a sign of weakness. It's a sign of tactical awareness. Tactical awareness? Recognizing when you need additional resources to complete a mission. You wouldn't try to perform surgery without proper instruments, would you? This is the same principle applied to psychological healing. The analogy made sense in a way that purely medical terminology hadn't. Marcus found himself thinking about mission planning in Afghanistan, the careful assessment of resources and risks before undertaking any operation. Maybe approaching his own recovery with the same systematic thinking would make the process feel less overwhelming. What's the first step? The first step is what you've already done. Acknowledging that you need support and being willing to accept it. The second step is understanding that recovery isn't linear. You'll have good days and bad days, setbacks and breakthroughs. The goal isn't to eliminate all psychological impact from your service. It's to integrate those experiences in a way that allows you to function effectively. Dr. Reynolds checked her schedule and looked back at Marcus. I'd like to see you twice a week initially, then adjust frequency based on your progress. We'll work on coping strategies for managing flashbacks and anxiety, but we'll also work on identifying the positive aspects of your military experience that can enhance your civilian medical practice. Positive aspects? Your ability to remain calm under pressure, your experience with triage and resource management, your understanding of how teams function in crisis situations. Those aren't liabilities, Marcus. They're assets. The challenge is learning to access them without triggering the traumatic associations. As the session ended, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not the false optimism he'd used to convince himself everything was fine, but genuine hope, based on a realistic understanding of the work ahead. Dr. Reynolds, he said as he prepared to leave. What made you choose to work with veterans? She smiled, and for a moment her professional composure shifted to something more personal. My brother was a Marine. 2 tours in Iraq, came home with injuries you couldn't see. It took him 3 years to find the right support, but when he did, he became one of the best emergency room physicians I've ever known. Where does he practice? Actually, you've probably met him. Dr. Johnson, the resident who took over your case yesterday night. He's the reason Dr. Mitchell recommended you see me specifically. Marcus felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. The understanding in Dr. Taku. Johnson's eyes when he'd mentioned the personnel change, the seamless way he'd stepped in to continue treatment, the complete lack of judgment or concern about Marcus's moment of vulnerability. It hadn't been professional courtesy. It had been recognition from one wounded warrior to another. He knew, Marcus said. He recognized the signs because he'd been there himself. And now he's in a position to help others who are fighting the same battle. As Marcus left Dr. Reynolds' office, He understood that his story wasn't unique. Somewhere in this hospital, other veterans were learning to balance their military experience with civilian expectations, finding ways to be warriors and healers simultaneously. The mission wasn't to forget who they'd been in service. It was to discover who they could become afterward. The emergency department was busy when Marcus returned, with the usual afternoon mix of urgent and routine cases filling the waiting area. "Doctor!" Mitchell looked up as he passed the nurse's station, offering a questioning expression that asked for information without demanding it. "First session went well?" Marcus said. "I'll be working with Dr. Reynolds twice a week initially." "Good. How do you feel about jumping back into rotation?" Marcus considered the question seriously, taking stock of his mental and emotional state, the way he'd once assessed his physical condition before difficult missions. The anxiety was still there, the awareness of psychological vulnerability that would probably never completely disappear, but alongside it was something new: understanding, support, and a concrete plan for moving forward. "I feel ready to try." "Doctor." Mitchell handed him a chart. "Room 7. Chest pain, probably anxiety, but we need to rule out cardiac issues. Think you can handle it?" Marcus looked at the chart, then at the emergency department around him. The controlled chaos that had intimidated him for months, but now felt familiar, manageable, like a mission he understood how to complete. "Yes," he said. And for the first time in almost a year, he meant it. 6 months later, Marcus stood in the same trauma bay where his breakdown had occurred. But everything felt different. The fluorescent lights still hummed overhead, the monitors still beeped their electronic rhythms, and the smell of antiseptic still lingered in the air. But the space no longer felt like a battlefield where he was fighting alone against invisible enemies. "Incoming trauma," the radio crackled. "Motor vehicle versus pedestrian, multiple injuries, ETA 3 minutes." Dr. Mitchell looked up from her paperwork, automatically scanning the room for available personnel. Her eyes found Marcus, and she gave him the slight nod that had become their silent communication about his readiness for high-stress cases. 6 months of therapy, 2 medication adjustments, and dozens of successful trauma cases had built a foundation of trust between them. "Chen, you're primary," she said. "Rodriguez, you're backup. Let's move." Marcus felt the familiar surge of adrenaline, but it was different now. Focused rather than chaotic. Energizing rather than paralyzing. Dr. Reynolds had helped him understand that his body's stress response wasn't something to suppress but something to channel, like a river redirected for productive use. The ambulance bay doors burst open with their characteristic pneumatic hiss, and the paramedic team rushed in with their patient. Marcus caught a glimpse of the victim. Young male, probably early 20s, unconscious but breathing. Standard trauma protocol initiated automatically in his mind. Airway, breathing, circulation, disability, exposure. The systematic approach that had saved lives in Afghanistan and continued to save lives in Seattle. "What do we have?" Marcus asked as they transferred the patient to the trauma bed. 22-year-old male struck by vehicle while crossing intersection. The lead paramedic reported multiple lower extremity fractures, possible internal bleeding, loss of consciousness at scene, but responsive to verbal stimuli during transport. As the trauma team worked around the patient, Marcus found himself slipping into what Dr. Reynolds called operational mode, the psychological state where his military medical training merged seamlessly with civilian emergency medicine. His hands moved with practiced precision, starting IVs, ordering tests, coordinating care with the efficiency that had once made him legendary among infantry units. "BP dropping," one of the nurses called out. 90 over 60 and falling. "Increase fluid resuscitation," Marcus ordered, his voice calm despite the urgency of the situation. "And get me a type and cross-match for 4 units. We might need surgery if this is internal bleeding." The patient's eyes fluttered open, revealing the kind of confused terror that Marcus remembered from wounded soldiers who'd awakened in field hospitals. Young men suddenly thrust into situations beyond their control, dependent on strangers for their survival. The expression was universal, crossing cultural and geographic boundaries. "Hey there," Marcus said, leaning over the patient so he could make eye contact. "My name's Dr. Chen. You were hit by a car, but you're in the hospital now. We're taking good care of you." "Am I going to die?" the young man whispered, his voice barely audible above the equipment noise. It was the question Marcus had heard dozens of times in Afghanistan, asked by soldiers whose lives hung in the balance. The same fear, the same desperate need for reassurance from someone who seemed to know what they were doing. Marcus had learned to answer honestly but hopefully, giving information without destroying morale. "We're doing everything we can to make sure that doesn't happen," he said. You've got some broken bones and we need to check for internal injuries, but you're young and strong. Your body knows how to heal. The patient nodded weakly, some tension leaving his face. Marcus continued working, drawing blood, ordering scans, coordinating with the surgical team. But part of his attention remained focused on providing the kind of steady presence that helped people endure crisis situations. 20 minutes later, the patient was stable enough for transport to surgery, where orthopedic surgeons would repair his fractured bones and general surgeons would address a small splenic laceration that had shown up on the CT scan. Standard work, good outcome, successful trauma management. The kind of case that had become routine in Marcus's current practice. As the surgical team wheeled the patient away, Dr. Mitchell approached with the expression that usually meant she wanted to debrief a complicated case. But instead of medical discussion, she had something else in mind. Good work, she said. Clean, efficient, excellent patient communication. 6 months ago, you couldn't have handled that case. 6 months ago, I couldn't handle any cases that reminded me of Afghanistan. And now? Marcus considered the question while stripping off his gloves and washing his hands. The ritual of cleaning up after patient contact had become meditative, a moment of transition between the intensity of emergency medicine and the routine of hospital operations. Now I think I understand that Afghanistan didn't make me unfit for civilian medicine. It made me different, but different isn't necessarily worse. Sometimes different is exactly what a situation requires. Doctor. Mitchell nodded approvingly. Speaking of different, there's someone upstairs who's been asking about you. Room 314. The room number was familiar, though it took Marcus a moment to place it. When recognition dawned, he felt a mixture of surprise and curiosity. 6 months ago, Lisa Martinez had been discharged with a clean bill of health and orders to report back to duty. What would bring her back to St. Mary's? Is she okay? He asked. See for yourself. But Marcus, she's not here as a patient this time. The elevator ride to the recovery ward felt different than it had 6 months earlier. No anxiety about facing a reminder of his psychological breakdown. No fear about confronting his own limitations. Just curiosity about why Sergeant Martinez had returned to the place where their paths had first crossed. Room 310074, but the person in it had changed considerably. Lisa Martinez wore civilian clothes, jeans and a sweater that made her look younger than her military uniform had, and her hair was longer, softer around her face. She was standing by the window, looking out at the same parking lot view that had provided backdrop for so many of Marcus's difficult conversations. Dr. Chen, she said, turning when she heard his footstep in the doorway. I was hoping you'd come up, Sergeant Martinez, though I'm guessing that's not your title anymore. She smiled, and Marcus noticed that she looked more relaxed than she had during their first meeting. The military bearing was still there, but softer, more integrated with civilian presentation. Just Lisa now. I finished my enlistment 2 months ago. How are you feeling? Any lingering effects from the accident?
Physically, I'm fine.
Better than fine, actually. The physical therapy helped me get stronger than I was before the injury. But that's not why I'm here. Lisa gestured toward the chairs by the window. The same arrangement where patients' families usually gathered during difficult conversations. Marcus settled into one of them, curious about what had brought her back to this place. I wanted to thank you, she said. Thank me? I didn't even complete your medical treatment. Doctor, Johnson handled your surgery, the nursing staff managed your recovery. I contributed about 5 minutes of initial assessment. You contributed more than that. You contributed honesty about your own struggles, which gave me permission to acknowledge mine. Marcus felt something shift in his understanding of their previous interaction. He'd focused so completely on his own failure that he'd missed the impact their conversation had on Lisa. What kind of struggles? The same ones you were dealing with. Difficulty transitioning from military to civilian life. Feeling like the person who succeeded in a military context might not be equipped for civilian challenges. Uncertainty about whether combat experience was an asset or a liability in normal situations. Lisa looked out the window again, gathering thoughts before continuing. When you told me you'd frozen because of my uniform patch, it was the first time I'd heard a veteran admit that the transition wasn't seamless. Everyone else, family, friends, military counselors, kept telling me that my service was an advantage, that employers would value military discipline and leadership experience. But that's not how it felt. No, it felt like I was pretending to be someone I wasn't, like I was trying to translate skills from one context into another without really understanding how that translation was supposed to work. I spent 6 months after our conversation feeling like a fraud, wondering if I should stay in the military where I knew how to be effective. Marcus recognized the description immediately. It matched his own experience almost exactly, the sense of being caught between two worlds without fully belonging to either. What changed your mind? I started seeing Dr. Bright. Reynolds. You'd mentioned her during one of your visits while I was recovering, and I decided to give therapy a try. Turns out, talking about the transition helped me understand that the difficulty was normal, not a personal failing. And now? Lisa smiled again, and this time there was genuine excitement in her expression. Now I'm starting a physician assistant program in the fall. Military medical experience counts as clinical hours, and my psychology degree gives me a foundation for understanding patient needs. I figure maybe I can help other veterans navigate medical systems more effectively. That's incredible. You'll be excellent at that work. I hope so, but the point is, I might never have had the courage to pursue it if you hadn't shown me that struggling with transition didn't mean I was weak or unsuited for civilian life. Sometimes it just means you need different kinds of support. Marcus felt something profound settle in his chest. Not just satisfaction at learning about Lisa's success, but recognition that his moment of vulnerability had created value for someone else. The breakdown that had felt like pure failure had somehow contributed to another person's healing and growth. How's your own transition going? Lisa asked. Better, much better. Dr. Reynolds helped me understand that integrating military experience with civilian practice isn't about forgetting where I came from. It's about finding ways to use that experience constructively. I'm not trying to be a civilian doctor anymore. I'm trying to be Dr. Chen, who happens to have military medical experience that makes him effective in certain situations. Like trauma cases, but also like situations where patients need someone who understands crisis management, or resource scarcity, or the psychology of people under extreme stress. Turns out those skills are more relevant to civilian medicine than I thought. They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, watching the afternoon traffic move through the parking lot below. Marcus realized that this room had become a symbolic space for him, the place where he'd first confronted his limitations, first begun to understand the work that needed to be done. Can I ask you something? Lisa said. Of course. Do you ever miss it? The military, I mean. The clarity of mission, the straightforward nature of the work. Marcus considered the question carefully. It was something Dr. Reynolds had asked repeatedly during their early sessions, probing at his feelings about service and separation. I miss parts of it. I miss the sense of common purpose, the way everyone understood their role and how it contributed to larger objectives. I miss the intensity of connection that comes from shared danger and shared responsibility. But, I don't miss the impossible choices, the moral complexity of being a healer in a war zone. I don't miss the hypervigilance, the constant awareness that violence could erupt at any moment. And I don't miss the way trauma accumulated without any real opportunity to process or heal from it. Lisa nodded with the understanding of someone who'd lived in that world. I think that's why civilian life felt so difficult at first. Not because it was harder than military life, but because it required different skills we'd never learned. Like emotional regulation in low-stress environments, or finding meaning in work that doesn't have obvious life or death consequences. Exactly. In the military, adrenaline and mission focus could carry you through almost anything, but civilian life requires sustainability, the ability to find satisfaction in routine work and normal relationships. And you figured out how to do that? Marcus thought about the question while watching hospital staff move through the parking lot at the end of their shifts. Normal people going home to normal lives, but carrying with them the satisfaction of work that mattered, even if it wasn't dramatic or heroic. I'm learning. I've learned that emergency medicine can provide some of the intensity and purpose I missed from military service, but without the moral complexity that made combat medicine so difficult. I've learned that the skills I developed in Afghanistan, quick decision-making, comfort with uncertainty, ability to function under pressure, are valuable in civilian contexts when properly applied. And personally, I'm learning that healing isn't just something you do for other people. Sometimes it's something you have to do for yourself, and that's just as important as any other medical intervention. Lisa stood up and moved toward the door, signaling the end of their conversation. But she paused at the threshold, looking back at Marcus with an expression of gratitude and understanding. Thank you, she said, for being honest about your struggles, for showing me that getting help was a sign of strength rather than weakness, and for demonstrating that recovery is possible even when it feels impossible. Thank you for helping me understand that my worst moment could contribute to someone else's best outcome. Sometimes that's how healing works. It's not linear, it's not individual, and it doesn't always happen in the ways we expect. As Lisa walked away down the hospital corridor, Marcus remained in the room for a few more minutes, processing the significance of their encounter. 6 months ago, This room had been the site of his psychological breakdown, the place where his carefully constructed post-military life had fallen apart. Today, it had been the site of recognition that breakdown and breakthrough sometimes looked identical, separated only by time and perspective. His radio crackled with notification of another incoming trauma case. Marcus stood up, straightened his white coat, and headed toward the elevator. The emergency department was waiting, with its endless stream of human crisis and medical challenge. But he was no longer the broken veteran trying to pretend he belonged in civilian medicine. He was Dr. Marcus Chen, combat veteran and emergency physician, bringing all of his experience, military and civilian, traumatic and healing, to bear on the sacred work of saving lives. The elevator doors closed, carrying him back to the battlefield where he'd finally learned how to win.